Hello friends, it's Jessica from Three Rivers Homestead and welcome to week 1 of the 2024 Every Bit Counts Challenge. This is where we're preserving something every day in the month of August. And I actually started a few days early just so on this first Sunday of August I would have a week's worth of content for you because there were only really a couple days before I would do my editing. So we started 3 days early. We're going to start slow with just some freezing projects, and at the end of the week we're going to do some canning of some wonderful fun items. So the first thing that I did this week on day 1 was go ahead and walk through my garden and kind of make an assessment of what needed to be done. The most pressing issue at this point was dealing with these peppers that I had harvested. They are beautiful yellow monster peppers from Baker Creek. I love these. They always grow abundantly for me. But I like to pick some green for green peppers, and I like to leave some on the plants to yellow for sweet peppers. So the first thing I'm going to do is just get them all washed, and we're just going to get them sliced up. Nothing fancy here with this project. I just had about 25 minutes to get something done, so dealing with these peppers was the perfect way to use that time. Now, another fun way to preserve all these peppers would be to make like stuffed peppers and go ahead and freeze them. But to be honest, my children are just not fans of stuffed peppers, and it always feels like a waste of the pepper to me because they just end up eating the stuffing out of the inside of it and then tossing the green pepper. So instead, what I like to do is freeze them for fajitas. Everybody in the family loves fajitas. We like chicken fajitas, steak fajitas. And so all I do is slice them up and then I vacuum seal them. So I have Levi busy here. He is labeling my bags for me with peppers and the year that we are doing this. They never last longer than a year because we do love fajitas that much, but we're putting the date on them anyways. Now, with a lot of foods, when you freeze them, it's really important to blanch them first, especially things like vegetables. It stops the enzyme action in the food and really preserves the texture and the nutrition of it. But I do find that if I blanch peppers, which would be boiling them for a short period of time and then shocking them with cold water before we get them in the bags, if I do that, it makes them kind of mushy when they thaw. So peppers are one of the few vegetables that I just prefer to freeze without blanching. Now we're using our 4 jars vacuum sealing machine. If you've been looking for a vacuum sealer, check out the link for 4 jars in the description. You can use my code and get 10% off of one. Now, I was always hesitant for many years to use a vacuum sealer. It always felt like such a waste of plastic to me. But that was because I didn't realize that these vacuum sealing bags can actually be reused. And I'll show you here in a minute how you can do that. But essentially what a vacuum sealer does is it just sucks out all the extra air from that bag, and then it heat seals the bag so that no air can get in there and cause freezer burn on your items, because that really is the enemy of frozen food. While freezer burned food is safe to eat, the freezer burn does affect the taste and the texture of the food. So it is definitely not ideal, and vacuum sealing will prevent that. So these bags are just a wonderful way to preserve that. You can see where the heat seal line is on the top. So if you want to reuse these bags, all you have to do is cut right underneath that line, and you just end up with a slightly smaller bag that you can wash out and reuse for your next freezing project. It's much like Mylar when you're freeze drying foods. You can reuse that Mylar in the same way. Just cut right below the heat seal line, wash it out, and then you can repurpose it. So vacuum sealing here is obviously easy enough that an 8-year-old can do it. It was a lot of fun for him to help me with this project. We ended up with 6 meals worth of fajita peppers. We're going to get those in the freezer, and then whenever we want to use them, we can just slice up one of our onions from storage, add it to our meat, and cook it all up, and we have some delicious fajitas. So very excited to kick off the Every Bit Counts Challenge with just a simple project. Now, part of preserving food is also preserving seeds for next year's growing season. So I just took some of the biggest and most beautiful peppers out of that bunch and simply shook the seeds out of it after we sliced them up and put them on a plate to dry. Once they are completely dried, we'll package them up in an envelope, and those will be available for us next year. Moving on to day 2, and it was another day where I only had maybe 25, 30 minutes to accomplish something. So I didn't want to do a canning project. I had looked in my fridge and noticed that I still had this small bag of garlic scapes that were getting pretty old. Something needed to be done with them. So I ran out to the garden and just pruned a few of my basil plants and decided we're going to make a quick pesto. So I chopped up my scapes here and put them into the food processor. And then I just added those basil leaves. These are just the prunings from my plants. And then when I make pesto, I like to use cashew pieces. It's much cheaper than pine nuts for my family, and it tastes just as wonderful. And then I like to add something acidic. I'm adding pineapple juice. Sometimes I do lemon juice or apple cider vinegar. And then, of course, we need a little bit of oil. We're just doing some olive oil and some salt, and it's that simple. And all we're gonna do is just blend this together in the food processor, and we're gonna have a delicious garlic basil pesto that is making use of those scapes that needed to be dealt with, as well as just my little basil clippings. So a really simple project. Like I said, it took me about 25 to 30 minutes to get it accomplished. And then I decided to freeze the pesto. I like to use these silicone trays. These are Super Cubes trays. I'll link them in the video description. And they're a great way to portion out little amounts of food and freeze them. I believe this is in 2 tablespoon portions. So whenever we want to add some pesto as a layer to our lasagna or make some individual pesto pizzas, all we have to do is pop out a few of these cubes and thaw them, and we'll be able to use them however we would like to. It's just super convenient. So these trays come with lids. We can just get those snapped on, and then I'll put them out in the freezer, and typically once they're frozen, I will pop them out and put them in some kind of freezer bag just to make it a little more convenient for storage. And so that was just my simple project for day 2. Now by day 3, I could move on to a little more intense project. I decided to go out into the garden and harvest some blackberries. We've had a great year for blackberries. I could have filled another couple of these bowls on that day, but I just needed this little bowl to accomplish this project, so I just went ahead and headed back to the kitchen. My goal was to use up these cherries that were in the fridge. I'm going to make a cherry blackberry marmalade, and we're going to can it. And I didn't have enough cherries for a full batch. That's why I harvested the blackberries to add to it so we would have enough fruit. So my first step is I needed to pit those cherries, obviously. I always save my cherry pits and add them to a pan of water and go ahead and get those on the stove boiling to make some cherry juice. The next step was to take my orange here and chop it up. We are going to add these little pieces of orange, both the peel and the pulp of the orange. Going to put it in a little pan and add some water, and we're going to get that boiling on the stove just to soften those orange peels up. There are our cherry pits, also making the cherry juice on the stove. Next, we're going to take those pitted cherries, and I'm just going to add the blackberries to it. Ideally, you want about 4 cups of fruit. That is what I was going for here. Also added a little bit of water to the bottom of that pot so that the fruit didn't stick. We're going to get that simmering to soften up those cherries. So we've got a full stove here of fruit that we are working on cooking down. After about 10 to 15 minutes of boiling, we have our cherry juice all complete. So all we need to do is strain out those pits, and we can go ahead and add them to the chicken bucket. And then we are ready to move on to making our cherry jelly from the pits. So I just added a half a cup of orange juice to it. And then I'm adding a package of Sure-Gel pectin. We're going to stir that together and get it on the stove and bring it to a full boil. We need to get it to that boil before we can add our sugar. It's really important that you follow all of the steps perfectly so that you get a gel on your jelly. While we're waiting on that to come to a boil, I realized that my oranges had simmered long enough that they were soft enough that I could then work on blending them. I have to blend my orange peels in my marmalade because I have several children that do not like to have the texture of an orange peel in their marmalade. So if you soften it and boil it like this first and then use your immersion blender and blend it down, they will not notice the peels at all. And we're going to add all of that orange mixture to the rest of the fruit now and let that be stirred up and continue to cook down so that those cherries soften. Now, the great thing about using these orange peels is that there's natural pectin in them, so when we make this marmalade, we are not going to have to add any packaged pectin to it to get this to set. But back to our cherry jelly. It has come to a full boil. Now I'm going to add 4 cups of sugar to it and stir that back in and wait for it to come back to a full boil with the addition of the sugar before we start putting this into our jars. So once it boiled, I'm going to go ahead and fill up my half pints here. I was able to get 6 half pints of cherry pit jelly, just delicious flavor. I love the color of this. It's so gorgeous. And this is just kind of a byproduct of using those cherry pits. It's just an addition to the cherry blackberry marmalade project that we were able to add. So we are going to use 4 jars canning lids here. These are my favorite canning lids. Once again, if you're interested in 4 jars products, check the link in the video description and you can get 10% off your order with them. So we're going to get these rings on, and I'm just going to set these aside so that I can process these jars with the marmalade, which is almost done. So now that my cherries are softened enough, I can go ahead and use that immersion blender again and kind of blend those up a little bit. Add 4 cups of sugar, stir it around, and then we are going to cook this down until it gets thicker and begins to kind of gel a little bit. And then I got 7 half pints of this cherry blackberry marmalade. I did have just a little bit left over in the bottom of my pot. It wasn't enough to fill another half pint jar. So I'm going to go ahead and just put this in a bowl and get it in the fridge so that it can set, and then the children can try it here later today or tomorrow to kind of see how they like the flavor of that. So wiping the rims of those sticky jars, adding our 4 jars lids, and then both the marmalade and the cherry jelly are going to process together in the water bath canner for just 10 minutes. So it's great. It gave me a full batch. 13 half pints is what I can fit in my water bath canner. As always, I'm going to add a little bit of distilled white vinegar to the pot. That prevents a mineral film from developing on the outside of these jars. We have hard water, so that's a necessary step for us. And after 10 minutes, we had 13 beautiful jars of cherry and blackberry marmalade and cherry jelly. So once that jelly had set, the next morning I went ahead and served it for breakfast for the children on some toast and with some scrambled eggs, and they said it was absolutely delicious. It had a very strong orange flavor, which they loved. Now for day 4 of the challenge, went out and harvested a little basket and decided I wanted to do some pickling. But the first thing I wanted to do is do some testing of my homemade vinegar. As you can see, store-bought vinegar has 5% acidity. That is the level at which you need to have your vinegar in order to prevent botulism. So I have this homemade apple cider vinegar that I really wanted to test to see if it is as acidic as the distilled white vinegar. So I purchased some of these pH strips off of Amazon. Now at 5% acidity, that store-bought vinegar should be somewhere between a 2 to 3 pH level. So I'm just going to dip my paper strip into the distilled white vinegar, and you can see it already beginning to change color. And then I'm going to do the same thing and dip a different strip into my homemade apple cider vinegar. And what I'm looking for is for them to be the same color. Unfortunately, I don't get very specific results with these pH strips, but it was enough to give me a general idea of what I was working with. So I'm looking at the color codes, and it's looking like the store-bought vinegar was somewhere between a 2 and a 3. It was definitely more of a red. You can see the homemade apple cider vinegar was definitely more of a dark orange, which tells me that the pH isn't as low in my homemade apple cider vinegar as the store-bought distilled vinegar. I tried another batch of apple scrap vinegar to see if it was maybe more acidic than the first batch, and unfortunately the results were very similar. I did not feel safe using the homemade for this canning batch. We're going to work on our pH levels, and in the meantime use the store-bought just to make sure and be safe. So in my brine for the pickled peppers, I need a ratio of 3 parts vinegar to 1 part water. To make sure I'm going to have enough brine, I am using 6 cups of vinegar to 2 cups of water. We're going to mix that together and just put it on the stove and let it warm up. I don't need it to come to a boil, I just want to get it warm. Now we have some homegrown garlic here, and I'm going to work on crushing those cloves up and filling my little half pint jars with approximately 1 to 2 cloves per jar. This is just going to add some nice garlic flavor to our pickled banana peppers. So nothing fancy here, just toss those cloves in the bottom of the jars, and now we can move on to our onions. I'm just trying to use up some of the smaller onions from our harvest that aren't, a good size for a meal that I would like to store. So just chopping up approximately 3 of those little onions and just splitting the sliced onions between these 7 half-pint jars. That will also give some wonderful onion flavor. Now we have these banana peppers. We saved some for fresh eating, but this is way too many banana peppers for us to eat fresh before they're going to start going soft. So I figured we are just going to pickle these. We can never have too many pickled peppers in our house. So just slicing these up, I like to slice them a little more thick. I think that gives a better texture when you open the jar. We also sliced up some hotter peppers to give a little spice because these are not very spicy peppers. Now, store-bought pickled banana peppers have yellow food dye in them. I don't know if you've ever noticed that before. We are not going to add food dye to our jars. We're going to add some turmeric, and it's going to do the same thing and give a lovely bright yellow color. So approximately 1/8 of a teaspoon per jar. If you don't add that, you're going to get kind of like a pale yellow color that isn't very appetizing. And same thing, about 1/8 of a teaspoon of salt per jar. And now that our brine is warmed up, we're just going to go ahead and top off all of these jars with a little bit of that brine. As I mentioned, it doesn't need to be boiled, but because we are adding warm brine to these jars, we just need to make sure that the temperature of the water that we put into our water bath canner matches the temperature of that brine. So we will add warm water to our water bath canner when we get to that step. So now we're just going to take a little chopstick and we're going to make sure there aren't any trapped air bubbles underneath all of those peppers. And then we can adjust the headspace to 1/2 inch once we get that done. Wiping the rims of our jars and then adding our 4 jars canning lids. We're going to get those rings on. And then these are going to process in the water bath canner for just 10 minutes. When we're done, we have 7 little half pints of pickled banana peppers that will be great for pizzas and tacos this winter. Our final canning project of the week on day 5, I decided to take some onions and garlic here and add them to our food processor. I like to use the food processor to do my chopping of onions when possible. It limits the amount of crying that I do from having to be above those onions. And we got them all chopped up, the onions and garlics, and we just took that and spread it amongst these 7 quart jars. We are going to make a chicken base here today. So we're starting with the garlic and the onion, and the next thing I'm going to do is take some chicken breasts and we're just going to cube them up. I'm doing approximately 1 large breast per quart jar. And that gets our jars about half of the way full with this delicious chicken. And now we can move on to our spices. Now you could do just about anything in this. I am going to add some bay leaves. I could have run out to the garden, but it was raining pretty hard on this day, and I just decided to use some freeze-dried herbs that I had in the house. These were freeze-dried last year and just honestly need to be used up because we're getting ready to freeze-dry this year's batch of herbs. So I added a little bit of sage. I'm going to add some parsley. You could do thyme, whatever flavors you like to have in your chicken meals. And these are, like I said, going to be a base. I'm going to explain to you how we're going to use these for various meals, but the first thing we need to do is add about 1/4 of a teaspoon of salt to each of the jars. And then just like with the pickled peppers, I'm going to add a little bit of turmeric just to give a lovely yellow color. I think that sometimes with chicken and chicken broth, you'll find this even in store-bought chicken broth, they'll add turmeric because it really gives that vibrant yellow color that you're looking for in a chicken noodle soup or a chicken broth. Now, these are going to be a base for whatever chicken-based meal that you like to do. You could cook up some rice and add a jar of this to the rice, add it over some mashed potatoes, add a little more broth and some noodles and make a chicken noodle soup. I like to use it for pot pie, so I'll often dump out the jar, add a little bit of extra broth and some arrowroot powder to thicken it, and this will be my chicken pot pie filling. It's really versatile, so just add whatever vegetables to it that you would like to have in any of those meals. Today I just did celery and carrots and chopped it up to fill the jar the rest of the way. And then once we have the jars full with whatever vegetables you like, just top it off with some water. We are raw packing this, so we are using room temperature water, and that just means we're going to put room temperature water in the canner, and then it will all come up to pressure and heat up at the same time. It's really important that you debubble these jars because that meat's packed in there pretty tightly. And then adjust your headspace to 1 inch. Once again, favorite canning lids. You know, these are all I use. Get your 10% off using the code in the video description. And we are going to get our rings on these jars and get them in the pressure canner. They are going to process for 90 minutes. And then we'll have some wonderful shelf-stable chicken meals here. This could potentially give us 7 meals if we use it and stretch it by adding other ingredients. I think it would be really good to maybe add a quart of canned potatoes to it, add another quart of chicken broth, and then we could add some kind of, I don't know, whatever other vegetables that you want. It's just so versatile. And some of the children could even just grab a jar of this because it has the meat and the veggies, and just warm it up and eat it exactly as is for a quick meal on one of their busy nights. So very excited about this. I'm going to get the pressure canner loaded up. This was a great project on this day. It looks like it's a lot of work, but it actually only took me 30 minutes to get all of the contents in those jars. And then while I cleaned my kitchen, I did this really early in the morning. I was cleaning up after breakfast, doing the dishes, cleaning the kitchen while I was babysitting the canner to get it up to pressure. That took maybe another 30 minutes. Then I set the timer here for an hour and a half, and you do have to then babysit the canner for a little longer while it comes to pressure and you can get it stabilized. But I was able to get my dinner prepped while I did that. So it was, you know, maybe a total of 30 minutes of actual work, and then it was just being in the kitchen to babysit the canner. So a really great project to get accomplished. So that is it for this week. We will be back next week with more fun preservation projects. I hope you're all having a good start to the challenge. We will see you next Sunday, friends. Bye.